Numbers don't panic, people do. Let's look at the psychology driving today's market. The same warning can lose force before the risk itself has gone anywhere, and the crowd can stop listening long before the logic has changed. The pattern usually begins when repeated cautionary signals keep circulating, yet each quiet interval makes the message feel less urgent to the people hearing it across the market crowd. That decline in urgency does not automatically tell us the concern was false. It often tells us repetition has started changing the crowd's emotional response across the market crowd. Notice the distinction. A warning can lose persuasive force even while the conditions behind it remain unresolved inside the broader market conversation across the market crowd inside collective attention. Once familiarity takes over, participants begin reacting to the repeated signal with less tension, less curiosity, and far less willingness to reconsider positioning across the market crowd inside collective attention. So the opening question is why repeated market warnings often lose impact on collective behavior, even when the concern itself may still deserve careful examination across the market crowd. At the practical level, the crowd starts treating the repeated signal as routine background rather than as an active test of assumptions in visible market behavior across shared positioning. That shift matters because attention is part of risk transmission. When fewer people engage a warning seriously, fewer people adjust behavior before stress arrives in visible market behavior. The result is not calm analysis. It is a quieter psychological response that makes old concerns easier to wave aside in meetings and commentary in visible market behavior. Participants may then confuse desensitization with improved evidence. The signal feels weaker, so the room assumes the underlying concern must be weaker too in visible market behavior across shared positioning. This is where misinterpretation enters. The crowd begins reading repetition as proof that the warning is stale, even though those are different judgments entirely in visible market behavior. What looks like maturity can therefore hide declining sensitivity, and declining sensitivity can reshape collective positioning before anyone admits it openly in visible market behavior across shared positioning. To understand the mechanism, separate content from response. The content concerns the logic of the warning, while the response concerns what repeated exposure does to attention inside collective judgment. Habituation and warning fatigue changes salience before it changes truth. The mind learns the rhythm of the alert and starts reacting with less intensity inside collective judgment across routine market reviews. That adaptation is useful in some environments, but it can also become dangerous when the warning refers to a risk that persists without constant visible confirmation inside collective judgment. As repetition continues, the room becomes more fluent in hearing the concern and less willing to revisit its assumptions from the beginning inside collective judgment across routine market reviews. The signal then feels psychologically smaller than it originally did. Familiarity lowers friction, and lower friction often passes for improved certainty inside collective judgment across routine market reviews. Once that happens collectively, fewer participants challenge the dominant posture, because the recurring caution now feels overknown rather than freshly relevant inside collective judgment across routine market reviews. The crowd may still acknowledge the warning verbally, yet practical behavior drifts elsewhere because routine exposure has diluted its emotional force inside collective judgment across routine market reviews. So the key context is this. Repetition can alter collective attention even when it leaves the underlying questions substantively unresolved inside collective judgment across routine market reviews inside shared interpretation. The loop begins when a cautionary idea appears often enough to become recognizable. Recognition makes the next exposure easier to process and therefore easier to downplay inside the active feedback loop. That easier processing does not feel like avoidance. It feels like familiarity, and familiarity quietly lowers the threshold for dismissing the warning as already accounted for inside the active feedback loop. Once the warning sounds routine, participants spend less energy retesting its logic. They assume prior exposure already did part of the analytical work for them inside the active feedback loop. This is how a repeated concern can lose social force. The room stops asking whether the warning is correct and starts asking why it is still being repeated. The focus shifts from substance towards style. People evaluate the messenger's persistence more than the unresolved risk that persistence was trying to describe inside the active feedback loop. That change in focus matters because attention is finite. If repetition itself becomes the story, the underlying mechanism receives less serious scrutiny inside the active feedback loop across collective decision-making. The crowd then begins coordinating around reduced sensitivity. Fewer people hedge, fewer people question the baseline, and fewer people feel urgency around the old concern inside the active feedback loop. Now repetition starts feeding a second mistake. The reduced reaction becomes visible to others, and that visible calm is treated as evidence that the warning has lost merit. Social proof amplifies the effect. Each participant sees everyone else reacting less strongly and takes that softer response as confirmation that the issue is less pressing inside the active feedback loop. The warning therefore decays twice. It fades inside individual attention, and then it fades again as the room mirrors its own lowered concern back to itself inside the active feedback loop. Once that process matures, the signal feels worn out before the logic has been disproved. Collective confidence then hardens around emotional familiarity rather than around fresh evaluation inside the active feedback loop. This is why stale feeling and stale reasoning cannot be treated as synonyms. A concern may feel old while remaining analytically alive inside the same market structure inside the active feedback loop. The mechanism does not require bad faith. It only requires enough repeated exposure for salience to decline faster than the underlying vulnerability changes inside the active feedback loop. The result is a crowd that interprets endurance as irrelevance. Because the feared outcome did not arrive on the room's preferred timetable, attention begins drifting elsewhere inside the active feedback loop. That drift can alter positioning, commentary, and institutional tone, even though nobody has actually resolved the core risk on the merits inside the active feedback loop across collective decision-making. A structural counterpoint matters here. Some repeated alarms really are overstated or poorly framed, and treating every recurring alert as equally strong would be its own analytical failure. There is also a rational exception. A warning can deserve less weight when its assumptions change materially, so repetition alone is never the only variable that matters in a serious review. The limitation is equally important. Real-time credibility is difficult to judge because silence and delay can look similar, especially when risk can stay latent for long periods before it becomes visible again. Another boundary is that market structure still matters. Liquidity, leverage, mandates, and incentives can either amplify or soften the consequences of declining attention under changing conditions inside practical limits. So this framework does not say repeated warnings are always right. It says collective desensitization can change how warnings are received before their logic is fully retested under changing conditions. A validating case exists whenever the room becomes more comfortable merely because the same concern has been heard many times already. That comfort does not resolve the concern by itself. The practical boundary is to study response decay and content quality separately, because one can weaken even while the other remains stubbornly relevant under changing conditions inside practical limits. Now we can answer the opening tension. Warning fatigue can reduce salience without proving the warning wrong, and that decay can alter market behavior independently of the warning's underlying truth value. The crowd is not necessarily proving the signal wrong. It is often proving that repeated non-confirmation changes collective attention in predictable psychological ways across the broader market. That is why lowered reaction should be read carefully. It may reflect better evidence, yet it may also reflect a room that has grown used to hearing the alarm. The key claim is narrower than alarmism. Repetition can erode credibility through habit formation alone, and habit formation is not the same thing as rebuttal across the broader market. Once that distinction is clear, the crowd looks different. Softer reactions may describe attention fatigue rather than real improvement in the risk being discussed across the broader market. This also explains why repeated concern can feel embarrassing to revisit. The room experiences familiarity as if it were analytical closure, even when closure never arrived across the broader market. Understanding that gap helps us read collective calm more carefully. The signal may have faded socially long before it faded logically across the broader market inside collective behavior. So the resolution is simple. Warning fatigue can reduce salience without proving the warning wrong, and the crowd can mistake lowered salience for lowered danger if it never separates those two judgments. The observation framework begins with process. Ask whether the room is answering the warning's logic or merely reacting to how often it has heard the warning before. Ask whether the concern lost force because its assumptions changed, or because people became more fluent and therefore less emotionally responsive to the same message. Ask what evidence would actually retire the warning. If that threshold is unclear, repeated exposure may be carrying too much interpretive weight on its own. Observe whether the signal now provokes eye-rolling familiarity rather than substantive review. That shift often reveals desensitization before anyone names it directly before drawing strong conclusions. Separate messenger fatigue from thesis quality. A room can tire of hearing a concern while still lacking a decisive reason to discard it before drawing strong conclusions. Keep the framework educational. Evaluate a repeated warning on its own logic rather than on how familiar it has become, because familiarity is a psychological event, not a decisive verdict. Ask what kind of evidence would still matter if the room had never heard this concern before. That comparison helps reveal how much familiarity is steering the reaction. Study what the crowd treats as settled. Evaluate a repeated warning rather than on how familiar it has become, especially when repeated exposure has started acting like its own conclusion. Behavioral interpretation does not tell us to dismiss or obey any current signal automatically. It helps us see how repetition can reshape collective attention and confidence. When the signal feels old, ask whether the logic weakened or whether the room simply adapted to hearing it. Don't follow the herd, study it. See you next time.